This fucking flag, it is innocuous to many people, but to mutualists, it represents all the common misconceptions and disinformation surrounding the ideology. Although some of the neo-Tuckerite and free market anti-capitalist crowds use this flag sometimes, as we see a modified version of it sold on the C4SS merchandise store, but regardless, most mutualists don't actually accept the flag. So what is the history of this flag? Well, at the dawn of the internet, people were really starting to play around with vexillology. Most of the time, people who were not even committed to or were proponents of ideologies just started making flags about them. And you've guessed it, mutualism was a victim of this kind of play. Because the internet is, well, the internet. We cannot easily find the moment when people made this flag, so we don't actually know who made it. Nevertheless, someone shouted out and it has stuck ever since. But why did this horrendous flag stick? The reason this flag has stuck around for so long actually represents the situation mutualism has been in for the past 2 centuries. The way we actually understand mutualism today is shaped just as much by anti-mutualists as mutualists themselves. Orange has stuck so well because it is a convenient narrative by both sides of the political aisle, that being capitalists and communists. The dominance also influences how the ingenious political compass memes fans understand mutualism. One of the biggest myths that people still believe to this day is that Proudhon proposed labor notes. The myth of labor notes is an infamous absurdity that comes from Karl Marx's hastily written response to Proudhon's The System of Economic Contradictions. One of Marx's most comically incorrect criticisms of Proudhon is him saying that Proudhon proposed labor notes, which isn't actually something he ever proposed. It is a complete fabrication. This is just one of the ways that anti-mutualists have really dominated how people currently understand mutualism today. Part 2. Context of Mutualism. Mutualism's history goes back pretty far, and to compare the mutualism of the past to the present, we need to take a journey through time. The origin of mutualism, or mutualist etymologically, goes back pretty far. Charles Fourier used the word mutualism in 1822, but this coining was not very prominent in his works. Only 4 years after that, an Owenite from New Harmony used the Mutualist as his pseudonym for writing a series of documents relating to cooperation in the American utopias. Soon after this, the word began to pick up politically when the militant silk workers of Lyons started to use mutualism, as they named themselves the Society of Mutual Duty. Proudhon himself is said to have gotten the word mutualism to describe his ideas from those silk workers from Lyons. This appropriation really marks the beginning of what we know today as anarchist mutualism. As I've covered in my previous video, Proudhon really provides the basis for contemporary anarchism. He puts together criticisms of the state, capitalism, and the church to form the thrust of what anarchism is today. He started his presence in the political scene with his Memoirs on Property, explaining his provocative thesis that property is theft. In this memoir, he calls for the general abolition of property. His economic proposals started to center around mutual credit in the late 1840s as a way to republicanize credit, which he would call a demonstration of socialism. With the birth of anarchist communism, mutualism was emphasized more and more to be parts of Proudhonism that were incompatible with communism, and to distinguish between the old and the new anarchisms, despite forms of mutualism being just as modern as forms of anarcho-communism. This really comes to a defining moment when the First International starts to split between the mutualists and the collectivists, who were bickering about whether farmland was social or individual property. This really didn't mark a split from Proudhon, as some would like to believe, but more so the developments of Proudhon in different ideological directions. Bakunin himself stated the new anarchist collectivism was Proudhonism greatly developed and taken to its ultimate conclusion. But in America, William Batchelder Greene was really the first apostle of Proudhon to the New World. Greene spent work adapting and exploiting Proudhon's mutual credit schemes and was to adopt his mutualist positions, which would become something of a Christian mutualism. Another theorist commonly associated with mutualism, but who did not call himself a mutualist, is Josiah Warren, who was an inspiration for Benjamin Tucker. Warren participated in the New Harmony utopia that the 1826 Mutualists was from, and he developed his libertarian socialism based on the ideas of cost-price. It should be noted that Warren was not fond of labels, so he didn't exactly use specific terms to describe his ideas, and so he was recognized as a contributor to mutualism through his connection to later mutualists like Tucker. So Tucker, Warren, and friends are really representative of a new strain of mutualism that is recognized today, and that being the free market anti-capitalist strain of mutualism. This new strain was very individualist, while mutualism of Proudhon emphasized the synthesis of community and property. The Proudhonian strain takes a generally anarchist without adjectives approach, while the Tuckerite strain specifically emphasizes the role of free markets much more significantly. Even despite the individualist and market emphasis, both strains maintained strictly socialist elements. Proudhon and Tucker both were socialists, and their mutualisms still are recognized as socialism under modern definitions. Both tendencies advocate against the exploitation of the working class by capitalists, and both tendencies also reject capitalist property norms in favor of norms much more in line with occupancy and use. So mutualism as a label began to refer to collections of non-communist anarchisms. The individualist anarchists of America began to become greatly affectionate of the term. Many of the individualists began to use the term to describe themselves in contrast to the anarchist communists. By the turn of the 20th century, any movement known as mutualism really began to ebb away. The vacuum of this gap begins to be filled with the age of the internet, where information becomes easily accessible and people are able to communicate independently across vast distances. The two tendencies of mutualism before mentioned really come into play with developments by Kevin Carson in his work developing Tuckerite thought in his studies of mutualist political economy. Sean P. Wilbur also has done extraordinary work developing and spreading Neo-Proudhonian mutualism by making its theory more accessible to new people. Currently, there exists a ton of information about Proudhon that did not exist 20 years ago to get an understanding of the significant pieces of Proudhon that are still untranslated. Part 3. Why this flag sucks. And so we come back to contemporary mutualism. First of all, the color orange is a terribly misleading color choice for newcomers to mutualism. By making it orange, people assume mutualism represents some kind of compromise between capitalism and socialism, when actually mutualists have been very vocally socialist throughout their history. The speculation for why it is orange is that Proudhon once called liberty the synthesis of communism and property. So the assumption here is that mutualism is some kind of in-between ideology between communism and capitalism, respectively. The first and most obvious point is that the synthesis is not a mix of two things. It is something much more. The second is that the quote is actually the result of a mistranslation by Benjamin Tucker. Tucker incorrectly translates community as communism in What is Property, which is an infamous mistake in mutualist circles. What Proudhon was actually talking about is the balancing of community and individuality, and is not in any way a reference to just mixing capitalism and communism like lab chemicals. I would also like to argue against this flag from a neo-Tuckerite standpoint. Markets were never a capitalist invention in the first place, no matter what modern capitalist apologists might like to claim. And the proliferation of market socialists throughout history shows that markets can be compatible with socialism. These historical free market socialists did not see themselves as some kind of third positionist mix between systems, but as on the side of socialism and the working class. They worked with organizations like the IWW to achieve revolutionary social change. Secondly, markets predate capitalism by thousands of years. Capitalism is generally said to originate around the 18th and 19th centuries after the French and Glorious Revolutions, which is but a fraction of the time markets have spanned the earth. So we just finally come to the fact that socialism's flag is red. Not only does the muted orange look repulsive vexillologically, but the color of socialism has historically been red, and mutualists are part of that tradition. This is why mutualists should use this flag instead to avoid confusion and to better represent our positions to newbies. The red shows that we are socialists, the black shows that we are anarchists, and the reciprocity symbol emphasizes mutual relations. Either that or just use traditional anarchist flags. Most of the flags that the internet shat out are just memes that politically illiterate children throw around. And this is Hades the Mutualist, and I'll see you in the next video.